So, working as a historian, I come across so many crazy stories that it was really hard to pick exactly what to talk to you guys about tonight. I thought about one of Christchurch's founding fathers who kidnapped and eloped with a 15-year-old heiress in order to get her money and her father's political help. Or I thought about the story of the severed hand that washed up on Sumner Beach, and it led to a story of a man who faked his own death and was discovered with pseudonyms and a suitcase full of wigs and disguises. But then a few weeks ago, this building came up in the news when it came on sale, and so I thought maybe I'd talk about the small scandal that surrounds this building and show how every place in Christchurch has some sort of story to tell, even if it's not quite as scandalous as those ones. So this is McLean's mansion, located just a few blocks north of here on Manchester Street, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you will be familiar with it driving past. The story of McLean's mansion is really the story of this man, Allan McLean. Allan was born in Scotland in 1822. He was just from a simple farming family, but when the farming family hit hard times in the 1840s, Allan and his mother and his siblings decided to immigrate. They initially went to Australia, but in 1852 they decided to come to New Zealand. Allan and his brother John quickly bought up a lot of property and started some pastoral runs in Canterbury, and they became very, very successful sheep farmers. Although they owned a number of properties, Allan's main property was Waikakahi, down in South Canterbury, just north of the Waimate River. And Allan, by all accounts, loved this property. He loved the land, he loved his dwelling house, so it was a real blow to him when in the 1890s the government decided to acquire his land for the Settlement Act. Despite much protest, Allan and his servants packed up and left in 1899, and he retired to Christchurch, a very wealthy man. It's at this time that Allan purchased the Manchester Street property from his brother John. John had purchased it in 1873 for their sister Mary. Mary lived there just for a few years before she died in 1875, and since that time, John had just been leasing the land out. The property was known as Holly Lee, and the history books will tell you that's because holly is the symbol of the McLean clan, but actually it was already called that before the McLeans purchased the land, and it's just a really nice coincidence, I think, for them. So Allan hired a very well-known architect, Robert William England, to design a palatial dwelling for him in the Jacobean style. It's a style that we don't see very much in Christchurch, but it's very fitting for a Scotsman. The house was completed in 1900, at which time it was reputed to be the largest wooden residence in Australasia. It was 23,000 square feet, and it contained 53 rooms. It was definitely a symbol of Allan's wealth to be a single bachelor living in this massive mansion all by himself. And so Allan lived there for the rest of his life until he was until 1907. Being as rich as he was, and being a bachelor with no known heirs, Allan's will was much talked about. He, of course, left a lot of his money to family, so he left £50,000 to each of his nieces and nephews, which was no small fortune in 1907. But as to the Holly Lee property, he left that to his longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Emily Phillips. She was to use the property for the rest of her life, and she was also to have £3,000 to keep sustaining her. So it's not uncommon for the wealthy to bequeath gifts to their servants, but it's quite a big gift for a single man to give his widowed servant. So I think it would have probably had Christchurch's tongues wagging quite a lot about that. Mrs. Phillips only actually ended up living at Holly Lee for a few years. In 1913, she decided it was too big and she was going to live in a smaller house of her own. So following Mrs. Phillips' removal, Allan's will dictated that the mansion was to become a home for destitute women, gentlewomen, not just any old woman, and it was to be known as the McLean's Institute. McLean left about £200,000 in his will for the running of the institute, which continued to be called Holly Lee until the 1950s. During that time, it benefited countless women and children who would otherwise have been completely destitute. So there's no doubt this was a very generous gift on Alan's part, a very generous gift, bequeathment in his will. However, there was one bequeathment in Alan's will that was a bit of a mystery when it first happened in 1907. Alan's will stated that Miss Mary Alexander Henderson was to receive £5,000 in trust. So £5,000 was a lot of money in 1907, and everyone was asking, who is Mary Alexander Henderson? Well, that story actually didn't come out until the 1920s. So Mary was born to Mrs. Margaret Henderson, who was the wife of John Henderson. However, Mary was not John's child. The Hendersons lived in Waimate, coincidentally very close to Maclean's Waikakaha estate, and it was eventually revealed that Mary was in fact fathered by Alan Maclean. So Mrs. Henderson travelled to Christchurch to have the child, and she was placed in the care of foster kids, but she still managed to get the Henderson family name. During Mary's early childhood, Alan Maclean often visited her and brought her many gifts. It said that he really doted on her, and he insisted that she have a good education and that she wasn't allowed to be adopted out, she was just fostered. But for whatever reason, as the years went on, Alan slowly stopped visiting her and eventually ceased visiting her altogether. So when Alan died, he did bequeath £5,000 to her, but it's not quite the amount of money that his estate really had, even for an illegitimate child, since he did recognise her. Following Alan's death, Mary married William Hensley in 1910, but William had problems with money and he declared bankruptcy just shortly after their marriage. So Mary had to assign all of the money that her father had left her to pay off the debts, and it was quickly gone. Her husband died in 1927, and Mary and her young children were left destitute. So, where does a gentlewoman, well-educated, go when she's destitute? Well, she turns to the Maclean Institute. So it turns out, rather ironically, that the daughter of one of Christchurch's most wealthiest men ended up in the same situation that his will had provided for. So the story of Mrs. Hensley came out to the public's attention in 1928, and it was a sensation. The newspapers just lapped it up. This is the only photo I could find of Mrs. Hensley, and it's like a 1920s paparazzi shot of her out shopping that day. This is the only one they could get. No, it didn't actually end up too bad for Mary. In 1934, there was the Parliament and Private Act of Parliament passed, and it ratified some of the Maclean Institute's money to actually support Mary and her children, so she did get a house. But Alan Maclean, from this story, went from one of the most generous benefactors in Christchurch to a cruel father who neglected his only child. And it's definitely a tale that I think you'll remember next time you drive past Maclean's mansion on Manchester Street. In contrast to the story of Alan Maclean, a man who the city thought to be generous and benevolent, but while he was shunning his own daughter, I thought I'd share the tale of George Henry Moore. A man not known for his generosity, but thanks to his daughter, ended up being one of the most beneficial men for Christchurch. So George Henry Moore was born on the Isle of Man in 1812. Like Maclean, he emigrated first to Australia, and in 1830 he was working on sheep stations there. In 1839, he married the daughter of his wealthy station master, Anne Commode. However, despite the relationship producing 4 children, only 2 of whom survived to adulthood, the marriage appears to have been a loveless and unhappy one. And after a few years, the pair separated. It seems likely that George married her for her money. With his marriage broken, George decided to travel to New Zealand in 1853 to investigate farming prospects. So despite being separated from his wife, George was bankrolled by the Commode family, and he was able to buy the very lovely Glenmark property in North Canterbury. George turned out to be quite the able farmer, and he expanded the estate to include 81,000 acres of land, which was huge in those days, and George became a very, very wealthy man, much more than Maclean. In 1864, George had his daughter Annie travel to Christchurch to keep house for him. Annie was 19 years of old at the time, and she had been living in the Isle of Man where she had been being educated. Sadly, just a year after Annie had arrived in New Zealand, her brother William, George's only other child, died. And this left Annie as George's sole heir in a very substantial heiress. Unfortunately, keeping house for her father was no easy task for Annie. By all accounts, George was a difficult man to deal with. He was known as a ruthless businessman, a bad neighbour, a hard employer, and a cantankerous local politician. For example, George was known as the King of the Scab. His nickname was Scabby Moor because he refused to clean the sheep of the pestilence, and keeping his pasture scabby was believed to be a tactic so he could buy up his neighbours' land as they also got infected. And so when questioned about his obligation to his neighbours, he's quoted as saying, "What are my neighbours to me?" Another account of George's harsh nature is the story of a beggar who not only got turned away from George's door, but George also commanded that his tenants refuse to let the man in for the night. With no shelter and it being a rainy night, the man died. With no remorse for his actions, it said that George even refused to let his tenants bury the man in a coffin. So when the newspapers found out, they described him as the mean, hard-hearted, barbarous man. So for poor Annie, living with this severe and harsh man dictated the way she was to live much the rest of her life. It's believed that George insisted that she never marry because any man who wanted her was only possibly after her money, mostly because he himself had done the same thing. Poor Annie spent pretty much most of her adult years as an isolated spinster, living with her father. But then, in his later years, George slowly went blind, and Annie thought, this is my opportunity. So in 1900, Annie entered into a secret union with Dr. Joseph Henry Townend. By all accounts, Dr. Townend was a well-liked, well-known, well-loved man. He's described as Christchurch's popular doctor. It's not clear exactly when Annie and Joseph met, but he is believed to have been George's doctor, so maybe just some of those house visits they got chatting. It's almost certainly a love match between the two, and they secretly conspired to be married. The contemporary newspapers at the time described Annie and Joseph's wedding as a very quiet one, with just 2 witnesses. Luckily, George couldn't read. One conspicuous absence from the wedding party was Annie's father. George Moore is believed to have never found out about his daughter's wedding or her subsequent marriage. But this sort of begs the question, where did the Townsends live then after they were married? Annie could have gone and lived with Townsend and his grown-up children from his previous marriage in Park Terrace, but surely George would have noticed if his daughter just suddenly disappeared all the time, and I feel like Annie's not the sort of girl to be off on a abroad holiday for a few years and just disappear. So I like to think that Dr. Townend moved in with them, and because George was blind, he just didn't know he was at the breakfast table that morning. Sadly, Dr. Townend died just 2 years after the marriage. So Annie only had that happiness for a short while. It's interesting to note that Dr. Townend did bequeath all of his estate to Annie. He didn't leave anything to his children, and that just kind of shows the trust that he had in her that she was going to take care of them for him. Annie's father followed her husband to the grave just a few years later in 1905 at the good old age of 92. The grumpy always live forever. Annie was the sole benefactor of George's £1 million fortune, and the inheritance made Annie the wealthiest woman in Canterbury. Even in death, though, George got his clause in. He had an input in his will that if Annie ever did get married, that husband wasn't getting a dime of his money. With George's money, Annie purchased a lovely property on Fendleton Road, which she named Mona Vale. Annie continued to own Mona Vale until her death in 1914. Unlike her father, or maybe in spite of him, Annie was a very charitable woman. This is not more evident than in her will, in which she bequeathed a large portion of her extensive estate to her stepchildren, her cousins, her servants, her friends, and to the numerous public institutions which she was a benefactor of. So generous was her endowments that the local newspapers even published part of her will for everyone to read. Annie's obituary, printed in May 1914, succinctly summarises her kind and charitable spirit and reveals how she became one of the most cherished women in Christchurch. The deceased lady, who led a most retired life, was chiefly known for her charitable work. She was one of the kindest and most humane women, and she was a liberal contributor to charitable and deserving objects, in many cases anonymously. She was greatly loved by all who knew her. And there is a nice little tie-in between our two stories, because Annie actually bought the conservatory from McLean's mansion in 1911, and she moved it into the Botanic Gardens, so you can go and visit. A nice little contribution from both Ellen and Annie.
Thank you, and we have time for questions. So let's throw those microphones around.
Thank you for the awesome talk. It was very entertaining. If I wanted to learn more about the quirky side of Christchurch history, which I do, what are some good resources I could look into to find these more sort of like obscure, interesting stories?
I think everyone likes the interesting stories, so the best place to go is just the newspapers. They publish everything. They published every marital dispute, every will that was, going to benefit anyone. So Papers Fast Online has almost all of the 19th century newspapers for Christchurch and all of New Zealand on there, and you can keyword search, and they're amazing. You just write murder and you'll find some crazy stories.
Okay, can we have a round of applause? Thank you very much.